Hey, welcome back to Spellbound. I'm BJ the Book Witch, and you're watching an episode of Book Both Ways, where we practice reading like a writer. So today we're going to be talking about middle grade villains. So before we begin, I do want to say that this episode does contain spoilers for Gilbert Ford's The Mysterious Messenger and Circus Mirandus by Cassie Beasley. But don't worry, I'll let you know when the time comes. Okay, so middle grade villains. Honestly, the villains, antagonists, are some of my favorite parts of middle grade books. What I love about middle grade is that there truly are no limits here. The plots are, or can be, huge and only make as much sense as they want to. And the villains, even bigger, larger than life. And, like in children's movies, their motives can be anything from exacting revenge due to a personal vendetta or your basic world domination. They're crazy, colorful, and cruel. But before we dive into our exploration much further, I want to clarify between two types of middle grades. First of all, middle grade is just an age group, not a genre. So within middle grade, you do have all the same types of genres that you have in adult books: historical fiction, fantasy, sci-fi, contemporary, you name it. But the distinction I'm trying to make here is between more literary middle grades and more surface level middle grades. And the difference here is not in the depth of the plot, but in the emotional depth of the characters. So this is going to be the distinction between Lemony Snicket's A Series of Unfortunate Events and Because of Winn-Dixie. For reference, the ones that do have more emotional depth are typically the ones that win more awards, like Newbery Honors Awards, like Bud Not Buddy or The Graveyard Book. Now, this distinction is important for us in our discussion on middle grade villains because of the similarities and differences between these two types. So the main similarity across almost all middle grades is that the villains are almost always adults, because the protagonists are almost always, you guessed it, middle graders, older elementary kids to young teenagers, so it makes sense that the bad guys are the grown-ups, just like in real life too. Roald Dahl, for example, is a famous middle grade writer. He wrote the BFG, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Matilda, James and the Giant Peach, and so many more. Now personally, I love Roald Dahl's stories. I don't love his oafish and decidedly ignorant sexism, but he's dead now, so that worked itself out. Once, Roald Dahl said something to the effect of, "When writing children's characters, don't make a character bad. Make them very, very bad. Horrible. They're not mean, they're terrifying." Think Miss Trunchbull from Matilda or Count Olaf from Lemony Snicket. One, a bully of a school principal who swings children around by their pigtails, and the other trying to kill 3 children and claim their inheritance. So what he means by this is that characters need to be extreme, and in most cases, this is very true. Dahl is onto something here. This is a good rule, and not just for stretching your writing and understanding what makes colorful characters, but because this is actually what middle graders prefer, and need in many ways. Hear me out. Middle graders don't want to read a book about an adult making adult decisions and using adult logic, because to kids, that adult logic is over the top, confusing, and simply unachievable. It is, in many ways, just as outlandish. To a kid's perspective, the adults around them are consistently oppressive, out of touch, and represent these extremes. So the characters in these extreme depictions, while silly and exaggerated, make sense. But of course, to every rule, there is an exception. And in this case, I would say a loophole. Because I really don't want what I just said to be interpreted as me saying that middle graders are disinterested or even incapable of nuance. That's not my point, and in fact, far from it. But middle grade books tend to show that nuance and that emotional depth in the characters of the protagonists and the peers of the protagonist, other children. So the adults and the villains are usually simple and extreme in their characterization and their arcs. Now, everything is a spectrum though, and the line starts to gray the more you start to approach those more literary middle grades, the ones we talked about earlier, the books where the main characters display emotional growth and change. In these books, the protagonists are often coming to some sort of realization or sense of self, and with that comes the realization or sense of others, which often means exploring the motivations and nuances behind adult decisions, reactions, and behaviors. What I'm saying is that the more emotional depth a protagonist displays, the more likely it is that the villain or the adult's motivations will become sympathized to some degree. So what does that have to do with these two books? Well, I read The Mysterious Messenger by Gilbert Ford last month. This is a delightful story about Maria, whose mom poses as a psychic medium in New York City, conning elderly women into connecting with their dead spouses. Maria has a secret, though. She actually can communicate with the dead, and they don't appreciate her participation in her mother's schemes. Now, the villain in this story is the mother, and she was actually my favorite part. She was giving some serious vibes of Madame Medusa from Disney's The Rescuers, even down to the way that she's illustrated. And I read Circus Mirandus by Cassie Beasley last week. This is about Micah, who tries to find a magical circus that his dying grandfather has told him stories about his whole life. According to his grandfather, the lightbender at this circus owes him a miracle. Now, throughout the book, you learn that the circus caters primarily to children. That's because children are the only people who still believe in miracles and magic, and that becomes a central theme of the book. And the villains here are two adults who decidedly do not believe in magic or wonder or anything like that. One is Micah's aunt, and she's a very strict and imposing figure who's come in to help care for Micah's grandfather as he dies. The other is actually a performer at the circus itself. She believes that she's wasting her time and her power at this circus, and she believes that she can just as easily destroy a child's faith in magic as she can cultivate it. So here we have two books and two types of villains. The difference here comes from the degree of the emotional depth of our two protagonists. In The Mysterious Messenger, there are some really heartwarming themes of friendship and family, and here's where the spoilers come in. Maria communicates with a spirit friend that she's had her whole life, and he leads her on somewhat of a treasure hunt across New York City and connects her with an elderly woman who lives across town. At the climax of the book, it's revealed that her ghost friend is actually her deceased father, and he's been looking out for her ever since she was a baby, and that her mother is actually not her mother at all, but the girlfriend of his father, who he was dating when he passed away. Now, this book does have some emotions in it. It's not all surface level, but the degree to which this revelation affects the main character is relatively low. This is all revealed at the climax, and the resolution swiftly explains, through summary, that Maria spends a little while in foster care but stays connected with the elderly woman who eventually becomes her guardian. And the emotional response to discovering that her mother has been an imposter? Mostly relief, because her mother is the villain of this story, and that's been consistent with the tone of the book. Circus Mirandus, however, attempts to dive a little bit deeper. We're looking first of all at mortality because the main character's grandfather is literally on his deathbed, but we're also asking some more existential questions, like looking at the power of faith and the power of doubt. This story is told through dual perspectives, through Micah, who attempts to find Circus Mirandus, and his grandfather, Ephraim, when he first finds it himself. Ephraim describes of finding the circus, meeting the lightbender, and seeing a bird show. And the bird woman is followed as well, in tandem with Ephraim's story. So we learn how she came to join the circus and how over the course of several years she becomes consistently frustrated with the overall purpose of the circus. She believes that she's wasting her time and her power, and that the whole idea of creating or reinforcing a belief in magic within children is dumb. And as a former Disney cast member, I took great personal offense to that. So she says that she'll prove that it's just as easy to destroy your faith in magic as it is to cultivate it. So she has a horrible final show in which she does something horrendous, and then she leaves the circus, on the very same day that Ephraim, now an adult, finds his way back. It's then discovered, at the climax, that this bird woman is Micah's grandmother. Apparently, she bumped into Ephraim right after her gruesome death show, and then they hooked up and got married. Now, all of this is told once again in summary from the perspective of Micah's dying grandfather. And Micah, he's asking all the right questions here. He's like, what, how, and why? And those questions are essentially shrugged off and said, well, by the time he learned what had happened, he had already fallen in love with her. And then during what we're supposed to assume is a blissfully happy marriage, she attempts to abandon, or maybe even murder, it was unclear, their baby, Micah's father. And then she disappears. And that's it. The other villain is the auntie. And she reminds me a lot of Aunt Petunia from Harry Potter. She's this very uptight, I don't want to believe in magic lady, and I'm going to hate the kid with dreams because of traumatic events from my past. So here's the difference between these two books. In The Mysterious Messenger, the tone is consistent. The emotional depth of the protagonist never goes below a particular level, and the emotional response to the villain at the end of the book stays at that level. The villain, the mother, is never justified, humanized, or sympathized with. She maintains her cartoonishly level of villainy throughout the entire book, including the ending. And it works because it's consistent. But in Circus Mirandus, the emotional depth does go quite deep in some places, and they attempt to make sense of some very complex feelings, emotions, and circumstances. And the villains are both extreme, but they're also both attempted to be humanized in different places. You know, by saying that the bird lady made Micah's grandfather fall in love with him, and by showing glimpses into the aunt's backstory that helps explain away some of her bitterness. So there is nuance introduced into these villain characters. However, there is no emotional depth or nuance introduced into the protagonist where it matters. Micah never has to come to terms with his aunt. He never has to attempt to understand her backstory or reconcile their differences in order to live together anyway. He just gets out of the car while she grips the steering wheel and stares straight ahead and literally just runs away with the circus. And that's it. And when he learns that the bird lady is actually his grandmother, he's just like, okay, and that's it. It doesn't affect him. So that's why it doesn't work. And in this case, the book would have been much better suited to follow Roald Dahl's advice. These were some mean and horrible and nasty villains, and they should have stayed that way because they ended up not affecting the protagonist at all. It would have made more story sense for the bird lady to have tricked the grandfather, or for the aunt to have tried to stop Micah from running away to the circus, something that would have been more consistent with their character as villains. Instead, they were created as these very large and imposing villains, and then painted with a brushstroke of humanity, and then ultimately abandoned with regard to the emotional capacity of our protagonist. There's a reason to this rule. When you create extreme villains in the form of adults, you're creating a world in which the protagonist is the driver. But when you loosen the reins on those villains and you paint them with humanity and nuance, and you don't do the same for your middle grade main character, you're creating a world that drives your protagonist. And that's not fun for anyone to read, especially not middle graders. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Middle graders, both characters and readers, are capable of incredible depth. You can go as emotionally deep as you want to, tackling concepts from mortality to spirituality, abandonment, trauma, you name it. But that depth has to come from the protagonist. Otherwise, you're contributing to a world that middle graders already live in, which is a world full of imposing forces that they're forced to sympathize with without giving them the voice or the chance to reconcile it within themselves and to grow. So what do you think? Who are some of your favorite middle grade villains? Were they written as terrifying and unforgivable like Ms. Trunchbull from Matilda? Or were they given a little more nuance like Aunt Petunia? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for sticking around. If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up. And if you loved it, hit subscribe. And of course, there's always Instagram. But in the meantime, happy reading.